How's it going, everyone? I'm Nick, and you're listening to episode 39 of the Fresh Perspective podcast. We've all heard of Aristotle and Kant, but are you familiar with Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, or Harriet Taylor Mill? If you've ever waved a rainbow flag at a pride parade, attended a Libertarian conference, or listened to an American rant about free speech, then you already have some sense of the powerful influence of utilitarianism, an approach to ethics popularized by these great philosophers. They asked questions like, do the results of our choices matter more than our intent? When is it permissible for a government to force a citizen to do something? And should maximizing individual liberty, happiness, and well-being be the primary objective of our society? Cristina, Sage, Sam, Ian, and others have joined me to discuss these fascinating topics. After several months, you've all finally talked me into recording the first half of our weekly online meetings. So I gave it a try. The recording began with the permission of all involved just after our announcements and ended a few minutes into the second half of the meeting. Since this is our first attempt at capturing a typical weekly discussion, the audio quality isn't ideal. Technical hiccups and user error notwithstanding, I was impressed with the quality of the comments and perspectives shared, and I hope you will be too, especially as we consider how relevant these ideas still are. This program is brought to you by your local Free Thought Forum. Our members come together from various belief systems and backgrounds to share their perspectives, hear new ideas, develop positive friendships, volunteer, and learn more about science, philosophy, and life skills. Every meeting is a celebration of free speech, civil discussion, and the free exchange of ideas. We want to ensure that as many people as possible have the opportunity to speak their mind and have their ideas contested and reviewed among peers in an inclusive and supportive community. So we are now authorizing the creation of new chapters around the world. If you would like to start a new chapter in your community, find official events near you, participate in our online meetings, or support our programs with a donation, please visit freethoughtforum.org for more information. So it's just fantastic to have you all out tonight. I'm really looking forward to this topic. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Sam, would you be so kind as to read for us the title and the first part?
Yes, I can do that. John Stuart Mill and Utilitarianism. Maximizing well-being and liberty for the greatest number. Our introductory question is, what is an idea or movement that you think is ahead of its time?
Moral philosophy and movement. Well, I think the transhumanists have a good idea going.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like
Well,
what a transhumanist movement is?
Well, transhumanists are focused on developing best ways for people to work with science and technology. It's continually affecting us ever more deeply. And specifically finding ways to make the best use of that to improve the human condition and make life better for people, to understand how we fit with it philosophically and socially, and all those sorts of fun things. So, elements like genetic engineering is becoming a big thing, and that's deep into transhumanist territory there. It affects us directly and deeply. We're doing a lot more with robotics now, and it's having interesting impacts both for things like cyborgs and for job situations. How does that affect humanity, and what are we going to do about it? What are all that sort of stuff. So it's quite literally about the future.
Have you read anything by Sherry Turkle?
It doesn't sound familiar.
So she's an MIT professor, social studies of science and technology, and her whole career has been, how does technology kind of affect, again, I guess, kind of like in that transhumanist thing, how we interact with each other, and how it changes how we interact with our environment. So I love her stuff. I'm sending a link to her website. She's an MIT professor.
Right.
So if anybody wants to look into, because I think you with the transhumanist thing would be very much interested in what she has to say. So yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Sage, but transhumanism, like the name, is basically talking about becoming something beyond human, almost like transcendental. So basically using science and technology to become more of what we could be, and leaving behind perhaps the less desirable parts of of human life, I guess.
Some people like to take it that way. My personal take on it is that we've always been transhuman. The idea that humans are based on improving ourselves and using the technologies better to make our lives more comfortable, more safe. Somebody one day picked up a stick, and ever since we've been kind of locked into that trend. It's always been a part of our existence. And so transhumanism is, in a sense, part of just understanding that as we go on toward even more advanced technologies, but realizing that's kind of who we are and always have been.
I love it.
I like how you put it, yeah.
I could answer the question next, actually. The first thing that popped into my head, well, a couple things, but what idea or movement, what's an idea or movement that you think is ahead of its time? It made me think of people talking about new advancements in our politics and in our, just how we operate as a society. Things like universal basic income, things like Internet Bill of Rights, outlining what the relationship between us and our, technology should be and that sort of thing. And also AI rights, when we finally have advanced, artificial intelligence, at what point do they deserve a vote? At that point, do they deserve to be protected and things like that? So yeah, whenever I hear about these ideas, it really, really strikes me as something that's just a touch ahead of its time.
Yeah, the internet and how we're going to relate to it and each other through it is definitely going to be central to the future that we're looking at here, since everything we do seems to go through it now. So have to really understand that. And it's actually a very pertinent question related to some of the social media issues that are coming up at play.
Yeah. And I hope we get into that today. So everybody don't be shy. Before we move on, does anyone else have an answer for that question? Yeah, it's something we're thinking about. And near the end of this primer, we're going to talk about a little bit of kind of what Sage had already brought up, the human propensity to expand our horizons and improve upon our situation, and what conditions need to be set to enable that to happen. Let's see, Sage, could you be so kind as to read the section on consequentialism?
Sure, consequentialism. For thousands of years, religious teachers and philosophers have perpetuated the idea that morality is primarily a matter of an individual's intent, character, and adherence to certain rules. In contrast to Kant's deontology and Aristotle's virtue ethics, however, is consequentialism, the philosophy that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the results, outcomes, or consequences of the action itself. This includes unintended consequences, so we should always try to predict as rationally as possible the results of our actions. For example, if a terrible person shoves someone to the ground, accidentally saving them from the path of a bullet, then that is seen as a net positive and a morally right action. When, if ever, would someone's intent matter more than the results of their actions?
Never.
I think it can when it leaves like a long-lasting negative effect on when it leaves like a negative lasting effect. So like the intent of a parent wanting to save their child from getting cut with the scissors is to slap the scissors off their hands. But then if the child is now afraid of getting slapped every time they touch something, they don't want like that abusive behavior, then that's a negative lasting effect that even though the intent at the beginning was to save them from getting cut by the scissors, well, now the child is afraid of touching anything because they think they're going to get slapped. Am I making sense? Like something like that could be a problem.
Definitely a problem, but I think the outcome in that case still is more important than the intent. Certainly, the parent.
What if a cut will heal, but then what about now the how many years of psychological trauma?
Right. That's the outcome, is the trauma. The intent was simply to prevent the child from hurting themselves with the scissors.
Right.
So the trauma matters more than the intent here.
Exactly.
Because
That's what I'm saying. Okay, so we're on the same page. Okay.
Oh, yeah, and I think everybody is kind of going to agree generally with that. That's why we had that silence when the question was asked. It's like,
Well,
although it is interesting to note that legally, intent is often brought up as a important part of the circumstance, perhaps maybe not more important, but often as a mitigating element. You know, did they intend to do harm is a big part of
Yes.
it.
yeah, I mean, for example, the intent of the president when he was talking to his supporters not too long ago, that's a big topic of discussion today. I mean, even if you throw out the actual result of the riot and actually what happened, what was the intent going into it? We care a lot about intent. Sage is exactly right. We care a lot about it, especially in legal terms when it comes to legal matters. I think the most obvious example is when we talk about murder. There's a huge difference between manslaughter and first-degree premeditated murder. You know, we treat them as very different things. Although a pure consequentialist, may look at them as the same thing. Well, the result is someone died, so this is essentially the same thing. As a society, when someone has been brooding and someone has been planning and someone has been stewing and coming up with nefarious schemes, we say that the thing that they did is worse because of it. Now, should our legal system be in the business of trying to read people's minds? Maybe not. You know, like maybe this is a bad place to be. But yeah, it's hard to shake off the fact that as a society we really do care about intent in a lot of ways.
And there are certainly instances one can look at where intent should matter, partly because one of the areas of the legal system is to figure out whether we need to put someone away, whether they continue to be a threat. Manslaughter basically just says, you know, you killed someone, but it was an accident, and you're probably not going to try to do that again. You're probably not a serious threat. So there may be consequences, but they're less severe. And this seems like a logical thing.
Before we get too into the weeds, I do agree with what Christina's talking about, because the consequences, I can't talk now. The consequences really do matter, and they should matter a lot more than someone's state of mind. For example, a couple weeks ago, we talked about Christianity and how a main tenet of Christianity is being a cheerful giver, you know, wanting to give to the poor for very selfless reasons. And if you're giving to the poor selfishly, you're basically, you know, committing a crime, or it's not as good. Again, when we say your state of mind matters more than the consequences of your actions, we're playing a very bizarre game. And so I think if we are going to err on a side, I think we all agree that it's best to err on the side of the actual consequences, the actual results of our actions. Then again, devil's advocate.
Do you believe then that if someone makes a mistake, completely innocently, they should be held to account at the same level, if it was the same outcome, as someone intending to do a thing, whatever it would be?
Yeah, I mean that was exactly the devil's advocate point I was about to bring up. Is accidents happen, you know? How do we deal with accidents? So yeah, it's definitely something that is a bit nonsensical if we take it too literally. But I think we're all comfortable with that. We all look at philosophies like this in that same light. They make sense to a certain extent, and beyond that, they get pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, I actually think that consequentialism can kind of be defended. A lot of times, intention can actually affect consequences. So, like the idea that if someone made a mistake out of wanting to do intentional harm, they're more likely to do it again in the future. And so I think there are ways that consequentialism can address why intent matters. Another thing, too, is even though we're not mind readers, a lot of times it's very clear what the intentions of other people are. So if we go to the example in the primer, it makes a big difference, I think, if like a stranger were to shove you to the ground versus a family member out of anger. If it's a stranger, part of the consequences might just be, well, because I got shoved by a random person, my life got saved. You'd be pretty happy. But if a family member shoved you out of anger, then one of the consequences of that might be a damaged relationship.
Yeah. No, I agree. These are all good points, guys. This it's also simple when we first look at it, and then it just gets more complicated the longer we talk about it. But let's go ahead and keep the ball rolling. Cristina, could you be so kind as to read the section on philosophic calculus?
Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. J. Bentham. So, how can we distinguish between good and bad consequences? In the late 18th century, the ethical hedonist Jeremy Bentham proposed that happiness, the absence of pain, was the best answer to that question. He taught his prized pupil, John Stewart Mill, that morality could, therefore, be a matter of calculation. The pleasure produced by an action, multiplied by factors such as how likely, intense, pure, present, or long-lasting that pleasure is, minus any pain produced, multiplied by similar factors, could tell you how good, positive, or bad, negative, the action was or would be. In short, an action is morally right if and only if it leads to greater overall happiness.
I found this calculus, this formula, very interesting. Essentially, if your answer came out negative, below zero, then you could point to it and say, "Oh, that's a negative behavior." It's remarkably simple, but it's something that I think we all deep down we root for it because it's like, yeah, this sounds right, yeah. Of course, his student would find problems with this. If I understand correctly, John Stuart Mill was against trying to make it mathematical. Rather, he tried to introduce certain main themes that we should keep in mind and go from there. But it's still such a fun idea. I mean, we've talked before when we were talking about Kant, we talked about how a lot of philosophers try to boil morality down to mathematics. And they, in my opinion, they never quite get close enough. It's never quite as satisfactory as they think it is to the rest of us, Actually, Cristina, would you mind finishing up that part?
Of course. Bentham was an early supporter of liberalism, free speech, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, children's rights, animal rights, prison reform, the separation of church and state, and the abolition of slavery, corporal punishment, and capital punishment. He was the founder of Utilitarianism, and his ideas and values had an incredible influence over his student, Utilitarianism's greatest advocate, meaning John Stuart Mill.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Before we jump into more information about John Stuart Mill, Sam, did you have more you wanted to add about Bentham?
Yeah, I actually don't know too much about Bentham. I think there is maybe an interesting conversation we could have about the value of having pleasure versus the value of avoiding pain. I think that is one topic that comes up in his writings, if I remember it correctly. And so, in other words, is it better to have something good happen, or is it better to avoid having something bad happen to you?
Yeah. Actually, that's another thing I wanted to bring up. Just before this paragraph, this equation that Bentham came out with, it basically allows for a lot of negativity, a lot of bad, as long as it's canceled out by even greater good. So, for example, is it a good thing to ride a bike? Well, to ride a bike, you have to first go through the pain and suffering of falling off your bike and scraping your knees and all of that stuff. But in his equation, essentially that pain is only a small portion of it. And as long as the joy you feel when you're cruising on that bike and feeling the wind through your hair, as long as that's greater than all the pain you went through to get there, then it's okay. It's a total moral good thing to do. Perhaps that's a bad example, but I think you all get an idea that a little bit of suffering, a little bit of pain is permissible, as long as it's, of course, the smaller addend. Sam, could you please read the next part?
Yeah, I got it. The greatest utility for the greatest number. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. J.S. Mill. In 1806, John Stuart Mill was born in London. He received an intensive and substantive education from his parents. By the age of 8, he had read the works of Plato, Euclid, and Herodotus. He soon became known as a radical freethinker and went on to profoundly influence modern science, economics, and politics. He was even made the godfather of Bertrand Russell. Today, Mill is known as the greatest English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century. Do we want to talk about that, or do you want me to go on to the next paragraph?
Oh, no, by all means. And of course, this goes for anyone else. If you do want to jump in with a comment, feel free to do so.
Was his father, James Mill, was another intellectual and wanted his son to be very well prepared for being a philosopher and scholar, and so pushed education on him really hard in his early years. At first glance, that might seem like a great thing, but in the next paragraph, it mentions that he went through a period of depression, and it's possible that the fact that he didn't get to, be a normal kid may have contributed to that, that all the pressure that was put on him when he was young to learn Greek and Latin and become an expert on all the classical works and all the philosophy and all the science up to that point, that even though that was very good for his education, it wasn't necessarily the best for his emotional well-being.
Well, to achieve the goal, at least, that his father had, did succeed in philosophy.
Yes. He definitely did. This is definitely a double-edged sword. We're talking later next month about parenting, and it's hard not to look at this and say, well, on the one hand, all that pressure and all that fierce education led to, one of history's greatest philosophers. On the other hand, though, he did suffer from a lot of things, perhaps, what we would call depression, but he did suffer from breakdowns. He did live through a lot of tragedy, and it was hard on him as an individual, just like what Sam said. So, yeah, I mean, what's ideal here? I guess we can go back to, because of his life, where more people benefited, even though he personally suffered, is, what is it that Spock says, the well-being of one person versus the many, or something like that, right? It's a real question. It's a real thing to grapple with, even when we're talking about a real person's life. It's not just hypothetical, of course. If it's all right with you guys, before we jump onto the back of the page or that second page, I do want to revisit a couple of the things that Bentham was promoting even back, around 1850 or, 1880. I mean, we're talking about, what is this, like Civil War times, right? This is before the temperance movement, for crying out loud. And even back then, he was advocating for things like we should never use corporal punishment against children. He was talking about decriminalizing homosexual acts. Of course, equal treatment and rights for women. Like, these are huge ideas, even so far back in time. And I think that's lost, a little bit when we consider so many great thinkers and advocates around the world and over the ages, just how ahead of their time they really were. So, hats off to Bentham. Today, he would sound just like your regular progressive, I guess. I mean, it's really inspiring, all of the things he was caring about, even back then.
Well, this is true. On the other hand, he was not nearly the first to think of them either. These ideas have been around for a very long time. We saw entire societies taking up certain elements of them at one time or another throughout history. Look at the ancient Greeks who were working on things like democracy, or elements of that where women were given additional rights, or rights to vote and things like that in different societies in the regions across Europe at one time or another. So in a lot of ways, these are just kind of recapitulations of things that people have been thinking about for a very long time.
I mean, it could be, but, I don't think all of these things that today we find agreeable to our modern sensibilities, I don't think Bentham, and then, of course, later on Mill, I don't think they just got lucky that they were on the, quote, right side of history on these topics. I think all of these things flowed very naturally from their idea of utility, their idea that whatever we can do to bring the most happiness to the most people, that is what is morally right. And I feel like talking about things, what people today would call social justice issues, a lot of those things flow very naturally from this idea that everyone should be involved in this equation. There are no higher classes or lower classes, people we want to be happy more than other people. No, it's everyone is basically on the same playing field. And so, yeah, it then makes sense to say, well, if we're trying to maximize happiness, why are we not letting half of our population, women, hold most of our jobs, hold most of our positions of influence or industry? Like I said, I don't think they just got lucky. I think it's just a consequence of this, very specific version of consequentialism.
I don't think they got lucky either. Saying simply is that these are ideas that go back a long way because people had come to similar conclusions in different places at different times. Bringing them all together is probably one that we hadn't seen quite like the modern world that we have now, but that these were considered positive things by other historical groups. It's kind of a recurring theme in philosophy. It's like, well, yeah, people have talked about that before, and they keep talking about it because philosophy is never really settled.
Yeah, and considering your point further, it's not like all of these ideas have been realized to the point that these philosophers wanted them to be, even now in 2021. So, I mean, so I guess you're right. Sometimes they stick, sometimes they don't. But let's go ahead and keep rolling. Sam, would you mind finishing that section, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So we're on the back page now. In 1861, Mill and his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, expanded Bentham's idea in their second book, Utilitarianism. They asserted that utility was about far more than simple expediency. They emphasized the idea that no one person's happiness matters more or less than any other person's. Therefore, we should always act in such a way that produces the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people, including women, minorities, children, and beyond. So I'll go ahead with the question, and I'll post a link here. There is a book, an essay that John Stuart Mill wrote called The Subjugation of Women. So if you think about the Western world, I think it was written in the 1860s, so around the same time when the first Western territories were giving women the right to vote. In it, he argues that women really haven't been given a chance to live up to their potential. And this essay was actually, I don't know if any of you have read Tara Westover's book. Does anybody remember the title?
Educated.
Yeah, Educated, that's right. This essay was very influential on her. Basically, in this book, this girl that grew up in this rural Mormon community in Idaho, she had grown up her whole life homeschooled and not learning about. So one example from this book is that during her first year in college, her history class is talking at BYU. Her history teacher mentions the Holocaust, and she has no idea what that is. And so it's Educated, of course, is kind of about her mind being opened up to new ideas. But John Stuart Mill was one of the influences that she mentions in that book. But anyway, The Subjugation of Women, I'll provide a link. The question I have is, what problems may arise when we only care about our own happiness or well-being?
The wording of the language, of course, takes advantage of the fact that most of us agree that there is a problem with being as selfish as possible. Not everyone believes that, of course. There are some schools of thought that believe that the more you live for your own best interests, the better off everyone is. But I think we can all back up and say this does lead to a few obvious problems. What argument would we make against that type of philosophy?
I think that there's a sense of symmetry that it really lacks if we think that we deserve things that other people do not. The question that we have to answer is why. And I think that even though we all seem like we're coming from different places, I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of our capacity to experience that we overlook.
I think there's also something to be said about synergy. When we all work with a common goal, we can accomplish amazing things. I mean, you could talk about the pyramids, you could talk about landing on the moon, you could talk about all of the, accomplishments of what humanity can get done, when we come together. As far as I can tell, these are all things that are only possible if we care about everyone's well-being and not just our individual well-being. I'm picturing the most dystopian, Mad Max type of scenario where everyone is just surviving and, looking out for themselves. We can't go very far with that. That essentially just finds us living in caves. That doesn't capitalize on the tremendous potential of humanity.
So if somebody did not enjoy participating in building the pyramids or helping with the moon launch, they should still do it anyways because someone else has told them that it's good for humanity. So they should suffer so others may benefit.
Yes. No. No. But that's a good point. Not everyone is interested in playing well with others. That's the term, of course, we use in early childhood development. Not everyone is interested in playing well with others. And what if you could come together and do something spectacular, but you, as an individual, you don't want to? John Stuart Mill, of course, has a lot to talk about that. But yeah, no, I would concede the point that it only makes sense for us to aspire to large group cooperative projects only if we all want to, because then we go into the situation where we're basically slaves to the collective or members of the Borg. There's that type of dystopia too.
Yeah, I think there's a good answer to why you wouldn't want to enslave a lot of people to build the pyramids later on. I think when we get to the harm principle, so when we get there, we can kind of go back into it.
So you're saying we should just enslave a few people?
Yeah, or why we wouldn't. Of course, John Stuart Mill was against all kinds of slavery, but when we get to the harm principle, we can find out why. We have to consider the needs and well-being of others and not just ourselves. Well, anyway, we'll jump, I guess, back into this topic when we hit kind of the relevant point.
For sure. And talking about slavery, that's actually the analogy in the Subjugation of Women that John Stuart Mill used. He essentially said, well, women, they are given a task to do in the household, and they're not paid for it. Many of them can't hold property or office or vote. They're essentially slaves. They're essentially domestic slaves. And it's really hard to argue against that point when you look at the, cultural norms of the time. So I find that a very provocative and accurate description. But yeah, Sage, would you be okay with reading the next part?
Pursuing higher pleasures. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of different opinion, it is only because they only know their own side of the question. After his mental breakdown, a rediscovery of fine art, music, and poetry helped Mill recover. He believed that not all pleasures were equal in value, and wrote that intellectual pleasures, such as learning, personal development, scientific discovery, and creativity, were superior to the more animalistic pleasures that were sensual or physical in nature. What else would you consider to be some of life's higher pleasures?
I knew this question was coming, but the only thing that comes to mind is like ice cream, pizza, like... I'm immediately failing this question.
Higher.
Yeah, I would say one thing that may qualify in this category is when you meet someone new for the first time and you actually have a chance to dig into their lives and you learn about where they've been, you learn about what they care about, you learn about what their hopes are, what they aspire to become. There's something very sweet about that. There's something very special about that. And I would consider pursuing that, meeting people and really getting to know them on a personal level. That qualifies. Perhaps that's similar to being in a place you've never been before, trying to find directions, when you're outside the country and trying to see the sights, just soaking in the novelty of the situation, I think is another one of those special experiences. But yeah, John Stuart Mill would say something like listening to classical music or hearing the finest poetry.
Well, a lot of it's just down to what you prefer. I mean, you can talk about these things like fine music or, intellectual discussion or whatever as the higher pursuits, the greater pleasures. But if you don't enjoy them, they're not a pleasure. And so really, this is something of a bit of snobbery, really, to say that the things you enjoy are the best things to enjoy, just because, you're a wise person or a capable person and you happen to enjoy them. So those fools over there, they obviously don't know what they're missing.
I mean, I agree with you somewhat. I do think, though, that John Stuart Mill makes the distinction where he talks about how if someone doesn't prefer certain things, they may have just never tried it before. They may only know their side of the question. Maybe you only know a life where you do nothing but, pig out on pizza and ice cream, like maybe you just haven't tried out those things. So I think, kind of going along with what you said, Sage, I think that the remedy to this is that we should at least try new things. We should at least try new pleasures, experiences, pursuits, hobbies, so that when we have a range of what is a finer luxury and what is a more animalistic level of happiness, we can tell the difference. I don't think, John Stuart Mill, I mean, perhaps I'm going a bit too far to say this, but he's kind of like Nietzsche. He's kind of an elitist in a lot of ways. But I think in this sentiment, I think he's saying something that actually does have a very solid basis. We really should be exposed. And this is kind of a theory that goes back to how we teach our kids in this country. Because we agree with him for the most part that kids should be exposed to things like classical music. They should be exposed to things like playing the violin, going to the theater, seeing a live theater performance, going to the zoo, going to museums, and experiencing things outside of their small window where they would just be playing Fortnite. Like, this exposure is a very positive thing. And I think John Stuart Mill took it further, where he says it is actually the thing that one of our purposes in life is to find those things, and then, of course, to pursue them, those higher pleasures. It's a very interesting idea. I think it's one worth mulling over.
It is. And, I don't disagree with you there, but I think it's a slightly different argument than to say that these are the specific pursuits you should be focusing on. In fact, it almost seems to contradict what Mill was arguing here. He was saying that you should focus on these specific sets of pleasures. These are the fine things. These are the best ones. But, cake and ice cream can go just fine with an opera. Hey, they're both great things, and you should try them both, and you should enjoy them both if that's what you want to do. What you're arguing sounds more like, to put it simply, variety is the spice of life. It's a very apt thing to argue, but it's not quite the same thing as what Mill would argue, I think.
And you're probably right. Just to make sure that I'm portraying the stance more accurately, he basically said that all things that bring you happiness in life, they can go in basically two categories. There's higher intellectual pleasures and then, the second half of pleasures. And so the idea that not all happiness is the same, it actually throws out some of the arguments against utilitarianism. For example, if happiness is the purpose of life, and I'm sure some of you have heard this argument before, then why don't we just install some device that constantly triggers our brain to release dopamine? Like if we can saturate our brains 24/7 with chemicals that make us quote unquote feel happy, isn't that essentially the point? And even before, the understanding we now have of brain science, even before that, John Stuart Mill says, well, not all experiences of happiness is really the same. Another one of life's higher pleasures would be fulfillment, being able to accomplish something and better yourself and things like that. And so I may be doing a terrible job portraying it, but I hope you guys get a taste of the idea. Let's see.
I think we have the general idea.
Cristina, are you close to your computer?
Yes, sorry, I'm here.
Awesome. No worries. Could you please read the section Individual Liberty?
Of course. Individual liberty. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, as long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. J.S. Mill. In their first book on liberty, Mill and his wife asserted that individual liberty was the ultimate greatest good for the greatest number. Furthermore, they wrote that a government should only be allowed to exercise power over, impose limits on, or control an individual against their will to prevent that individual from harming others. Harm, according to Mill, does not include offense or fleeting discomfort. This is known as the harm principle. In other words, an ideal society is one that allows people to do and think as they please as long as they don't harm or limit the freedoms of others. Should the government have the power to protect people from harming themselves? Why or why not?
Nope. Government should mostly be concerned with harming other people. What you do with yourself is entirely up to you.
But then what about people who have, mental health illness, or they don't know that what they're doing, they're harming themselves? Like, what about children?
Well, those people, okay.
So
I guess there is the exception for competency. You have to be a functional individual, but that's about it.
yeah, and
we do the same thing with children. Children are wards of the parents or wards of the state because they aren't yet quite competent individuals.
yeah. Sorry for interrupting you there, Sage. But yeah, Cristina, it's interesting that you bring up children, because this notion that maybe government should have the power to protect us from ourselves because government knows best. Maybe you are a danger to yourself and someone should step in and protect you. He was very much against this kind of paternalistic idea. You don't know what you need. We know what you need. This to him was a type of abuse of power. Yeah, just like what Sage was describing, he wanted to err on the opposite end, the opposite side. He wanted to basically say, no, if you want to harm yourself or be a complete moron or, endanger yourself with your own dumb ideas and actions, that's on you. It's better to let people do that than to have government step in on the opposite end of that spectrum. Government step in and tell us how to live our lives when we know better how to live our lives. And so, yeah, in this section, you get that very strong libertarian vibe that we were talking about before.
Indeed. This is one of the reasons Mill is always quoted in this particular meetups. And yeah, I generally agree that, like I say, with the exception of people who aren't quite ready to take on the obligations of society for one reason or another, they should be generally free to do what they will with themselves as long as it's not harming others. That's the real trick, because that's kind of where government and where these limitations need to come in the interactions between individuals, where harms may occur, where there may be some kinds of imbalances that are particularly harmful to the health, happiness, and safety of both individuals and the society as a whole.
Yeah, it looks like Ian brought up, I think, a really good point. He brought up an example that shows an apparent contradiction in John Stuart Mill's philosophy that I think would be good to explore. If an important scientist wants to kill himself, but his expertise is needed to maximize happiness for society, should the government keep him alive? In this particular case, on the one hand, we're not maximizing the overall happiness of everyone. But on the other, there's the issue of the scientist's own personal liberty. Oh, and hey, Connie, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ian. That's a really, really good question, because it's bizarre. The harm principle is something pretty straightforward. I think we can all understand. And if we grew up in the United States, it's something that is second nature to us. It's almost like innocent until proven guilty. It's like you have the freedom to do whatever you want to do as long as you don't impede on the freedom of others or harm others. That's it. But the point that Ian brings up is, what if you have the potential to do a tremendous amount of good, but you choose not to? Or I think he talked about a scientist committing suicide that has the potential to do a lot of good for people. I don't know. For my research, I didn't really see lost potential as a big theme in John Stuart Mill's writing. He may have addressed it, but I'm actually not sure. Do you guys have anything else to add on that question? It's a great one.
I don't know if he did. It's been my experience, though, that a lot of these philosophers, what we kind of rate about them at first glance is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And so it's very possible that John Stuart Mill brought up a question at some point. I'll try to look it up and see if I can find something. I really like this harm principle a lot. I like the idea that we should let people have autonomy over their lives. There are so Ian's example is good. There's also cases where what someone does to themselves is permanent. So, for example, if someone wants to cut off their own hand or engage in self-mutilation, that's another example where most of us would think that the government should intervene, or anybody should intervene if they're nearby. And that would seem to violate that principle. I'd really be interested in hearing everyone's opinions on that example.
Well, I'd like to add just this kind of side note. I'm not sure if this is helpful, but I'll go ahead and say it. There's also this idea of becoming a burden to other people. For example, the harm principle, it's easy to imagine it in terms of alcohol. If I drink a ton of alcohol, and I have a party just right here in my house, a party of one, right? And then I wake up with a hangover the next day, and I gain weight, and I feel like garbage. That's something that under the harm principle, it's totally fine for me to do. I'm basically only hurting myself. I'm not hurting anyone else. However, if you just change a couple of small details, if I'm at a bar and I drink way too much and then I want to drive home, well, then my actions are no longer just about me. It's about potential harm I can cause to other people. There's a gray area. There's a middle ground. Say I'm staying home and I'm drinking myself crazy, and then people around me have to take care of me, have to clean up vomit or something really embarrassing like that. I'm not necessarily harming people, but I am becoming a burden on them. I am inconveniencing them. So, perhaps that is tangentially related to the harm principle. I don't know if you guys agree, but there are some bad decisions we all make that then other people have to compensate for. Other people have to then step in and help us out, or they have to maneuver around our actions. We're not necessarily harming them, but it's something to take into account. Would you guys agree?
Well, yeah, every action has the potential for negative externalities, which is basically what you're describing. And we should be held accountable for the actions that infringe upon other people's and their rights and freedoms. That's part of the obligation we take on as free people. We have to be responsible as well and take responsibilities. There are certain aspects of living in a society that are required of us when we do that. It's that's part of the reason we don't hold people who are not mentally capable to account for their actions. They have neither the freedoms nor the responsibilities.
Which of us are really mentally capable? Let's be real here, But let's go ahead and jump into that final section. I'll go ahead and read that. Free thinking and living. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. John Stuart Mill. Every person should be well educated. This goes back to some of your comments, Sage and Cristina. Every person should be well educated, free to express their opinions, eager to expose those opinions to honest criticism, and open to changing their mind when convinced to do so by strong arguments. While a government should allow its nation citizens to say, think, believe, and publish what they want, Mill also believed that our society should never try to control people through social pressure, cultural norms, or what he called the tyranny of the majority. He encouraged every person to live life as if it's an experiment, try new things, be unique and eccentric, and allow others to do the same. This, he argued, was the only way to ensure that the truth was never suppressed and that society can improve over time. What, if any, should be the limits to our free speech?
Well, about the only sort of limit we should encourage or accept is the one that causes immediate and severe, physical harm to others. Because a lot of things people say, may make them emotionally unhappy, may actually reduce, at least in the short term, their general well-being in that sense. But we shouldn't forbid that. In fact, we actually, in some sense, should encourage it, because that's how we manage to bring people out of their comfort zone and make positive changes. So that's kind of a difficult distinction to figure out there, but there are actually some forms of harm in speech that are necessary.
I really like how you brought up it being an immediate and physical harm. John Stuart Mill would definitely agree with you. he stressed a lot in his book On Liberty that we shouldn't even consider harmful rhetoric that tangentially eventually leads to harm. He wanted the distinction to be very clear. It's like, no, if you incite a riot, or the popular example is yelling fire in a crowded place, like a theater, and which would force everyone to get up and rush into the bottleneck, which is the door. If something you say directly and obviously leads to harm, that is the one and only time you can restrict free speech, which is, again, very radical. This is something that Americans take seriously. It's hard to argue against, but it is worth considering, though. For example, and I'm just being devil's advocate right now, you have fake news, right? You have conspiracy theories all over Facebook that your grandma shares with her neighbor, and overnight you have people believing that 5G cell phone towers cause cancer. They believe that a pedophile ring is being run under a pizza store. A lot of terrible things could happen, and these things, of course, would lead to further harm, just because of this very common principle of free speech. For example, with the case of the secret society running very dangerous and disgusting things in the basement of a pizza store, if I remember the story correctly, people showed up with guns to liberate the captives in the basement, only to find that there was no basement of that one pizza store. I mean, that's just one conspiracy theory in what we're living in, an entire sea of conspiracy theories that, because of our, I think, justified obsession with free speech, these terrible ideas and these harmful ideas run rampant. And so I suppose that's the other side of the argument. If we want everyone to live in the same reality, if we want to prevent potential danger to people, maybe there should be more types of censorship and things like that. Now, personally, I'm not in favor of that, but this gets very complicated very quickly. But I'm interested. Does anyone else have a comment on what, if any, should be the limits to our free speech?
Nope, I pretty much agree with you that should be pretty open-ended, and in response to the idea that some ideas are dangerous and we should not express them, I would submit that the best way to deal with those ideas is not to hide them in dark corners, because then they just fester and people do things weird with them, but to let them come out and show their merits. And if they have none, they will clearly be thrown out the window.
And John Stuart Mill even pointed out those dangerous, disgusting ideas, those harmful ideas, those upsetting ideas. Even those should never be censored. Even those should never be silenced. And I take that personally, of course, because I'm very happy about being an atheist, and I'm very happy about criticizing religion, for example. And not too long ago, right? Not too long ago, those were considered to be disgusting, terrible ideas. And in some parts of the world, I can still be put to death for those ideas. I mean, not just me, of course, but deviants and so on. I can't remember who said it, but there's a great phrase, there's a great quote that says something like, if the freedom of speech of one person is put in jeopardy, then it's put in jeopardy for every person. Freedom of speech isn't giving us the privilege of talking about apple pie. That's that's not necessarily why we have free speech. We have free speech to protect us even when we're talking about those controversial things, even when we're talking about those things that society is nervous about. And unfortunately, even conspiracy theories. We have to grapple with this idea that today's disgusting ideas might be tomorrow's best ideas. We don't know. I mean, we don't know what we're suppressing when we suppress it.
I think it can get a little bit complicated. So we have laws against libel and slander. So if you say something false about somebody, either printed or spoken, you are entitled to your opinion. If you share an opinion, something that falls under that category, then that speech is protected, even if it's widely disagreed with. However, there are examples, you all might be able to come up with better examples than I can on the spot right now, where it can be kind of hard to distinguish between fact and opinion. So, for example, creationism is something that are facts that they say about the world, which me and a lot of people here would regard as false. That evolution didn't happen, or they might have some variation of it, old Earth or young Earth. These are clearly not facts. They're factual statements that are wrong, but they're not just opinions. I mean. And yet, at the same time, it seems to me that that's something that would be protected.
So I have a great quote here from John Stuart Mill that talks about the importance of hearing people's perspectives, from their perspective, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, which is something that feeds into this conversation about free speech. A lot of times when we talk about controversial topics, about theology or about young earth creationism or whatever, many of us tend to be very well aware of our side of the debate, and we only hear a caricature of the other side of the debate. Of course, this also deals with politics and all sorts of topics. But this is what John Stuart Mill said about that. He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either option. Nor is it enough that they should hear the opinions of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them, and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. Yeah, isn't that great? I like that a lot.
Yeah, it seems like he's anticipating the idea of a steel man, making your opponent views that you disagree with as strong as you can, so that you know the best alternatives to your point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. Go to the source and hear the best arguments. This is something that we were talking about at our last couple of debates. Let's look at the best arguments from both sides, and if possible, from the source. I like that a lot. And that's part of the reason when we covered, what was it? Hinduism and Vedic faiths. We actually invited the local Hare Krishnas to come to the meeting. They didn't oblige us, which is, totally fine, but it's still something that I think is always important to remember. But there's also a couple of great quotes I have here about eccentricity. In that last section we read, John Stuart Mill basically encourages us to be weird, to be unique, to be eccentric, to live life in a very unique way, because every life is essentially its own experiment. And so since we're all conducting an experiment anyway, we might as well go all in, and try to be as unique as possible, which is interesting to me. It flies in the face of this idea of conformity. Some of my friends who are very conservative, for example, this is their biggest complaint with liberals. Just why are they just so weird? Why couldn't they just be just a little bit more normal? Just a tiny bit more normal. Would it kill them? It's like just trying to be not so weird. But people like John Stuart Mill, of course, says, no, embrace your uniqueness. It's really interesting. So this is another quote from him. In this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom, is itself a service, precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach. It is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric. Eccentricity has always abounded when and where strength of character has abounded, and the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. So yeah, you don't let people be themselves, then you're basically suppressing the geniuses, the inventors, the innovators. You're suppressing artists. You're suppressing what could be, the type of person that could change the world for the better. And the last quote, super quick. This is probably my favorite one. He who lets the world, or his portion of it, choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. So, in a sense, the way I read that, it basically says, if you're not embracing who you are, if you're not living life like an experiment, then you're basically just playing, monkey see, monkey do. You're basically wasting some of your humanity. And I just find that a really inspiring sentiment.
If you go based off of that quote, then Sage should have actually been able to do his voice at the beginning.
Yeah, it's true. I'm a suppressive conformist. You all got me. You got me.
See, we're trying to stand out here, trying to make people interested. Doing little voices can help with that.
Yeah.
One of the complaints you hear about philosophers and such is that they're droll and boring, and you don't want to go through all of that. There are ways you can make it more engaging, and entertainment is certainly one of them.
We've covered so many topics today, so many that apply just to our organization. The idea that we can express these opinions, express these ideas, and we want them to be contested and tested among our peers. I mean, there's so much of that Enlightenment coffee shop vigor that I get from John Stuart Mill, but also his very simply put, but perhaps more complicated to implement moral system. I mean, yeah, this is a rich, this is a very rich well here. We have a lot to talk about. But in terms, we were talking about being accountable before, and we are very much over our time for our break. Are there any concluding thoughts that anyone would like to share about John Stuart Mill before we open the conversation up to any topic?
I think we've done a pretty good job.
Yeah, I really think that it's very hard for us to appreciate just in the modern world where a lot of John Stuart Mill's to kind of see what he was dealing with in his own time and place. The idea that women should have the right to vote in England at the time that he was expressing his ideas, women couldn't vote, they couldn't run for office, and of course, we mentioned earlier that Jeremy Bentham actually, amazingly, in the 19th century, was writing about gay rights. And of course, when I read that, I had a hard time believing it. And so I looked up, and it turns out that it's completely true. He wrote something, John Stuart Mill's mentor wrote something in favor of gay rights, but it was so ahead of its time, didn't end up getting published until the 1970s. And so I think that's a really good illustration of how radical these ideas were. If you were to just talk to like the average person at the time, I think John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham wouldn't have been held in super high regard.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I was very impressed with his commentary about the tyranny of the majority. I've heard that before with an argument about why we shouldn't have, a purely democratic vote for president, for example. Oh, you don't want the tyranny of the majority. And I've been very confused about that term. But seeing how Mill used it as basically the pressure you have to conform, the stifling of your uniqueness, it's something that I think we've all experienced to some degree or another. And granted, I mean, part of being an adult is sacrificing a little bit of your uniqueness, sacrificing a tiny bit of your, impulses and will so that you can, again, play well with others. But this idea that just putting it in context, putting it in this phrase, the tyranny of the majority, I mean, it really puts it in perspective. We really don't just have the government that can oppress us and force us to act, contrary to how we believe we should act. We also have just what is popular, what is normal, what is culturally acceptable. And, while that could be a very good thing sometimes, it's also, I mean, it's just like government. It could be very benign one minute and it can be very oppressive the next minute. And so I suppose this is my soapbox for the day. If you find yourself really pushing people to just get with the program, to, conform and to get a hint about acting just like everyone else, maybe we should take a step back and say, well, this is something compared to a tyrannical government. It's something we should be careful with. And so, yeah, thank you everyone very much for your comments today. I'm glad that you felt free to express yourself and to contest with some of our ideas. Thank you all very much for participating in this very first recording too. Let's go ahead and open up the floor to any topic that you guys would like to discuss. We started the conversation today talking about WandaVision and a few other fun things. So yeah, you could talk about current events, you can talk about entertainment, you could talk about whatever's on your mind. So I yield the floor to you.
Well, your last comment certainly plays well into current events. We don't necessarily want to hold the companies that are putting all of these extra sanctions on who can be on their platforms and who can say what to account. They're private organizations. They have the freedom to do what they want. But basically, they're going through and doing these things that seem oppressive because that's what they believe, and they may well be correct, that the majority of their customer base wants. So it's not just a direct form of tyranny of the majority, but in some ways, economic tyranny can come out of this.
Give me a little bit of a background in terms of what's going on with the companies.
Well, they have done things, a variety of interesting things, as I understand it. I'm not perfectly schooled in what's exactly they're doing, but for instance, they've shut down a couple of, or at least one that I'm aware of, organization that was entirely open to hosting any kind of content or any kind of speech because it's seen as a platform for extremists now. And it may well have been seen that way before, but with recent events, that's become more of an issue for them. And the money they're, of course, going to lose out on the hosting fees and everything else that company would have provided, but for them, it's worth it to play to the greater number of people. There have been a number of notable individuals who have simply been, removed from the platforms or banned for one reason or another. There are reports of particular groups and specific types that have just simply been made to disappear, essentially. This is one that I've been hearing about on Facebook in particular. Some groups that have right leanings, or even, from what I understand, some of the libertarian groups have been just completely silenced.
I can add some context too, real quick. So from what I understand, a lot of media companies, especially Facebook and Twitter, have basically been trying to find any groups within their platform that were talking and planning for the Stop the Steal riot, all the events that happened at the Capitol. Anyone connected with that, they've been removing them from their accounts or deleting their accounts. And then groups that had a lot of these people in those, they've canceled those. If any group was openly about Stop the Steal, they've been just deleted by Facebook. You have TVIN said Amazon Web Services also, which hosts online websites and apps. Yeah, so Amazon is in on this. And they basically just said no. And on one side of it, you could say, well, if terrorists are plotting things on your platform, perhaps you should delete them. And if your platform is completely overrun by them, maybe you should delete the platform. But it's actually beyond that. From what I understand, Amazon has certain terms of services that requires a certain level of regulation, kind of like what Sage was talking about. You have apps like Parler, where their whole claim to fame is, we have no regulation. Say what you're going to say. Free speech all the way. But then, of course, you have white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, all that. They always come out of the woodwork. And so Amazon said, okay, we're no longer hosting this platform. And the entire app just disappeared overnight, essentially. And like I said, you also see this across Twitter. You also see this across Facebook. So, yeah.
I'm back.
Hey, Cristina. So yeah, just to kind of summarize what Sage was alluding to before, this isn't necessarily the government reaching in and saying, kill all these accounts. That's not what happened. This is the free market. This is Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, looking at the business pressures involved and saying, you guys are not good for advertisers. You guys are not good for business. We do not want to host these types of things for economic reasons. It's kind of a tyranny of the majority, but with what is agreeable to advertisers and things like that. We see similar things on YouTube, where people make controversial YouTube videos and YouTube shadow bans them or deletes their content or deletes their channel just because their content isn't friendly to the economic environment that they would like to have. Yeah, I think we just discovered a third category. You have government that can infringe upon your free speech. We have the majority opinion, and then you also have just the free market. The free market can also limit your free speech.
Yeah, especially when the market in this case is so dominated by just a few actors.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are nervous, not just people on the far right, not just Republicans, a lot of people are nervous about how much power like 5 companies have over our ability to communicate with each other over the internet. It is crazy, guys. And I'm no Trump supporter, right? But still, we're in a very precarious, very bizarre situation.
Yeah, I think that even if I could snap my fingers and make things be however I would want them to be, this is one situation where I think edge cases would exist where you'd have a tough time deciding whether something falls into the category of actually planning harm versus just, airing, your opinion.
And there's a lot of guilt by association too. Like I said, groups that just had a plurality of people, involved in some of these far right groups, even those get shut down. Sage was talking about even libertarian groups. So yeah, guilt by association, it really bothers me. But from a business standpoint, what really are their options? What could they do?
Oh, they've got options, but they're going to be hard ones, like changing their market a little bit and going after a slightly different crowd. That may not be something you want to do, of course, once you have a nice settled one like they do now. I mean, they're the dominant force, and there's good reasons for that. They have a lot of people who really like what they do. And if you start changing that, you risk alienating a large portion of the markets.
If you have enjoyed this conversation or have learned something from it, please leave a like, subscribe, and share it with other open-minded people. All of those small things really do make a big difference and help others find our organization and our podcast. Thank you. That is all I have for you today, but the conversation continues across social media and in the comment sections below. Do you agree with today's message? Am I mistaken about some detail? What feedback or ideas do you have for this program or for the Free Thought Forum? Feel free to share your perspective.